My name is AmyLynne Hicks, and I am excited to talk to you today about my Capstone project, Improving Reunification Rates in Foster Care, Promoting Connections by Adapting Family Systems Theory. So, for the agenda today, first we'll talk through the learning objectives for this presentation. Then we'll talk about an overview of my capstone project as a whole, which will lead us into discussing each of the three main products, the systematic literature review, the conceptual paper, and the practice application paper. Finally, we will talk about some key findings from my project and some implications for social work practice. So first, let's start and talk a little bit about our learning objectives today. We have four main learning objectives. First, we are going to learn about identifying factors and themes present in successful and failed reunifications. Second, we'll learn definitions for family systems theory and talk through the advantages and disadvantages of using family systems theory in child welfare practice. Third, we'll talk about some adaptations for family systems theory that could fit the child welfare population a little bit better. And finally, we'll talk through some interventions that could be used to implement and utilize the adapted family systems theory in child welfare social work practice. So let's get into it. We'll start with an overview of my capstone project as a whole. So, child welfare services vary slightly from state to state, but in Kentucky, child welfare is housed in the Department for Community Based Services, or DCBS. DCBS is under the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. According to DCBS's Standards of Practice Manual, DCBS accepts reports that meet the statutory and regulatory definitions of abuse or neglect, where the alleged perpetrator is in a caretaking role. Now, according to Kentucky Revised Statute, Chapter 600.020, there are several factors that are classified as either abuse or neglect, including but not limited to perpetrating or allowing someone else to perpetrate physical or emotional maltreatment, sexual abuse, or exploitation on the child, or failing to ensure that the child's essential needs are met. Now, if a report on abuse or neglect is accepted for investigation, it is assigned to the state worker to investigate who is an employee of the cabinet, who is approved to provide services to children and families. Once the investigation is assigned to an investigative worker, they use two main decision points to evaluate whether the child is safe in their family home. When the social worker first contacts the family and the child, they have to determine right then, is this child safe in this environment while we conduct our investigation? So this involves determining if the environment is safe for the child, if there's any current threats to the child's safety in the environment. Second, when the investigation ends, the worker must determine whether the report is valid and then evaluate whether the children involved in the investigation are at risk of experiencing abuse or neglect in the future. If safety threats or risk factors are present during the course of the investigation, services are immediately implemented by the worker in an effort to improve the child's safety, which includes creating a safety plan with the family with clear instructions on what has to be done to make sure that the child is safe, assessing for services that could assist the family, like referrals to a food bank or for childcare assistance, and offering in-home intensive services. We'll talk a little bit about in-home services when we talk about the systematic literature review. If there's still safety threats present in the home despite the services that are implemented by the worker, or if these safety threats present, if the safety threats present an immediate risk to the child and the child cannot be maintained in their home environment, that child is placed either in foster care or in a relative or kinship care placement. For most children placed in foster care, their initial permanency goal is reunification with biological family members. Research has consistently shown that the best environment for a child is almost always at home with their biological family, even when some factors of abuse and neglect are present. Additionally, research shows that children report experiencing significant trauma during their removal and sustained placement in foster care. According to the National Child's Traumatic Stress Center, a traumatic experience is a frightening, dangerous, or violent event that poses a threat to a child's life or bodily integrity. A potentially traumatic event in childhood is called an adverse childhood experience. So, children who have been removed from their families and placed in foster care have all experienced at least one adverse childhood experience by nature of being placed in foster care. And research suggests that children in foster care have a higher likelihood of experiencing more adverse child experiences than children who are not involved in the child welfare system. Research shows that children who spend time in foster care have higher amounts of traumatic experiences than their peers who are not placed in foster care. Additionally, research shows that children with a greater amount of adverse childhood experiences who spend time in foster care were less likely to experience successful reunification. And those who did have successful reunification still stayed in foster care much longer than other children. Research also suggests that spending an extended amount of time in foster care has a detrimental impact on children, including children exhibiting signs of mental illness, increased substance abuse, reduced self-esteem, and elevated risk of suicide. Individuals who spent time in foster care as children were more likely to experience adult emotional disorders and other psychopathology than other adults who did not spend time in foster care when they were children. Furthermore, most research has not found that spending time in foster care provides better outcomes for children than the children who do not spend time in foster care, and that the outcomes of foster care placements are neutral at best. So it is extremely important for children in foster care to discharge care as soon as possible. If we minimize the length of time a child spends in foster care, we might be able to minimize the amount of trauma they experience in childhood and set them up to have more positive outcomes, even into adulthood. So, according to research by Wildeman and Emanuel and by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration on children, youth, and families, between 2000 and 2011, 5.91% of children in the United States were placed in foster care. That is nearly 800,000 children during that time period. Foster care was designed to be a temporary, short-term solution to abuse and neglect allegations with the end goal of reunification with family members. And for the most part, it functions as intended. Unfortunately, there are some barriers that complicate the reunification process. Nearly 20% of children who are reunified in the United States end up being replaced back in foster care within 2 years of reunification. When you expand that time frame to 10 years, the number jumps to 50%. So within 10 years of being placed back with their families and discharging foster care, those children, 50% of those children are back in foster care. Most of the research surrounding failed reunification focuses on micro level barriers, likely because that's the easiest stuff for social workers to address. These barriers vary widely. They can include anything from parental substance use to the behavior of the child to staffing issues within the child welfare system. When I examined these barriers, I noticed that there was not that much research on the factors that were present in successful reunifications and failed reunifications. I was curious what was different about reunifications that were successful versus reunifications that ended in the child being placed back in foster care. This was the foundation for my first product, my systematic literature review. So we touched on this a little bit earlier. We'll talk a little bit here about the products in my capstone. So first is the systematic literature review, where I examined factors present in successful and failed reunifications. Then the conceptual paper, which examined family systems theory and how it could fit into child welfare populations. And finally, the practice application paper, where I suggest some adaptations to family systems theory that might better fit child welfare practice, and some interventions to help implement and utilize this adapted theory in child welfare practice. We will start here with the systematic literature review. So most current research examining reunifications from foster care focuses on specific programs that could help improve outcomes. And one of the main ones here is intensive in-home family services. We talked a little bit about that at the beginning, and this is where we're going to talk about it a little more. So intensive in-home family services are a comprehensive paradigm with a wide range of components. In Kentucky, they are in-home, community-based intensive services that are designed to reduce safety risks that jeopardize a child's placement in their home. These services are usually provided in conjunction with each other. So, preservation services are provided when a family is at immediate risk of their child being placed in foster care, while reunification services are provided to families whose children have already been placed in foster care and are now preparing to discharge from foster care and reunify with their family. The 1980 passing of the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act really elevated the importance of these family preservation and reunification services. Early family reunification problems were mainly concerned with therapeutic interventions like individual group family therapy sessions. Since therapy is not manualized, and each therapist has their own unique method of delivery, we don't know that much about the specifics of those early interventions in family preservation. Um, as such, early studies on family reunification found inconsistent results. Um, but after analyzing individual initiatives, researchers discovered that most reunification services did contribute to an overall improvement in positive outcomes. In one study, about half the children who were at risk of removal were able to avoid or postpone being placed in foster care. Other research includes examining how population characteristics impact reunification, whether outcomes are improved more by parental education or parental involvement, and reunification for children who experience specific types of abuse or neglect or who are from specific population subsets. When we examine each of these avenues to improve outcomes, social workers can learn a great deal about failed reunifications, but like we said before, most of the research does focus on solving the problem rather than addressing the underlying causes. Well, I was curious about what those underlying causes might be, which led me to my research question: what factors contribute to successful and failed reunifications from foster care? All right, there we go. So, to conduct the systematic literature review, I had to figure out what factors are present in successful and failed reunifications. So, I created my own screening and selection tool that you can see on this slide. I used this screening and selection tool to evaluate the literature I found related to reunification so I could narrow the search down and really focus on the research that I needed. I divided the tool into 5 main categories: population, length of time, location, outcomes, and article qualities. In order to be included in my literature review, studies had to include families involved in the child welfare system whose children were removed and placed in foster care. If the study included families that were not involved in the child welfare system, or families who were involved in child welfare but whose children were not placed in foster care, I did not include those studies. I included studies with children who were placed in foster care longer than 1 day and studies that took samples from the United States. If the study included children who were in foster care less than 1 day or samples taken from outside the United States, they were excluded from my review. I also included studies that specifically looked at successful and failed reunifications. So if a study did not include reunification, or if the study looked at specific interventions in the reunification process, those studies were excluded. Finally, I included studies whose full text was available to read and studies published in English or that had an English version available. Studies in which the full text was not available or there was no option for an English version were not included. So as you can see here in my Prisma diagram, I started with 506 potential publications. From there, I assessed titles and abstracts and removed some duplicate entries, which accounted for 471 publications. I also had planned to remove any records that would be marked ineligible by an automation tool, or if there were any other reasons why a record would need to be removed, but there were not any. So from there, I was left with 35 potential publications, which I used that screening and selection tool that we just discussed on the previous slide. So I was able to eliminate 26 publications using that screening and selection tool. The reasons for elimination: 14 of them were eliminated because they focused on specific interventions, which is one of my exclusion criteria. 8 of the studies compared children in foster care to children who were never placed in foster care. And one of my inclusion criteria were that the studies only focus on children in foster care. 3 studies focused on children who never experienced reunification, and 1 study took place out of the United States. So this left me with 9 studies to include in my systematic literature review. Once I narrowed the studies down to 9, I used my data extraction tool to extrapolate the information from all 9 studies. I created this data extraction tool to include the following information: the study design, the purpose of the study setting, the study duration, the sample, the method of data collection, the study outcomes, and the study results. On this slide is an example of the data extraction tool with one of the 9 studies that I included. But before we get into this study, I would like to define the term trial home visit. So traditionally, as we've discussed, when a child is placed in foster care, custody of the child is transferred to the state child welfare agency. And upon reunification, custody is transferred back to the family. This process works pretty well for many families, but in some cases, the family could benefit from some increased support during that transition period. Trial home visits are one of the most important tools that social workers can use to increase supports during the child's reunification process. A trial home visit is defined as a period when the child is returned to their family's care, but is still in the custody of the state child welfare agency. By allowing the state agency to retain custody while the child transitions back to their home environment with their family, the family is able to focus on accessing the appropriate services, while the state has access to continue monitoring for ongoing safety issues or other concerns. If issues do come up during the trial home visit, social workers can address them immediately to prevent the child from re-entering foster care. The United States does not have a federal framework for trial home visits. So just as the details of the child welfare system vary on a state by state basis, so do the way that trial home visits are envisioned and implemented. So as a result, not every child in the reunification process has a trial home visit. There's also not a specific length of time suggested for each trial home visit before custody is returned to the family. So, for example, in both Indiana and Maryland, policy states that trial home visits should not last any longer than 90 days, but they can be extended if needed. But in Minnesota, it says trial home visits should not last longer than 6 months. In Kentucky, trial home visits are typically around 30 days, but they must be shorter than 6 months without prior court approval. One of the main advantages of trial home visits is the ability for the child to maintain connections between their biological and foster family during the transition process. Often children have steadily increasing visitation as their time in foster care passes. For example, when they first enter foster care, they might have visits with their family once a week for a couple hours. But by the time they exit care, they might be having overnight visits every weekend. That increasing visitation schedule creates more opportunities for contact between the child's biological and foster families, which can assist in the reunification process. These connections are often facilitated by the social worker who's involved with the families. So it is super important for the social worker to be educated on the benefit of these connections during the reunification process to ensure that these connections are maintained for the duration of the foster care experience and beyond. So now that we know what a trial home visit is, this study will make more sense. This was a logistic regression model study using general estimating equations that evaluated whether trial home visits could help increase the likelihood that a reunification could be successful. The study took place in an eastern mid-Atlantic state in the United States over a 5-year timeframe plus 2 years of follow-up. It included a sample of 4,101 children under 16 years old who had entered foster care between July 1st, 2011 and June 30th, 2016, and who had discharged foster care to reunify with family within 2 years of initially being placed in foster care. The data was extracted from a state automated child welfare system. And the outcomes of the study showed that the overall reentry rate for children who experienced reunification was 19.7% within 18 months of reunification. There were some factors identified that seemed to correlate to both lower and higher reentry rates. Children who participated in a trial home visit had a much lower reentry rate of 12.2%. Unfortunately, though, children who experienced reunification because it was court ordered, despite the state child welfare agency recommending against it, had a reentry rate of 35%. Children who had been placed in foster care multiple times had a reentry rate of 29.6%, and children who were removed primarily due to their own behavior had a reentry rate of 25%. The study results showed that trial home visits do seem to improve reentry rates, resulting in more successful reunifications, whereas children who were reunified against recommendations, who had been in and out of foster care multiple times, or who had significant behavioral issues all seemed to reenter foster care more frequently. So this is just one example of my data extraction tool, and I applied this tool to all 9 studies that I included in my systematic literature review. So as a result, I was able to extrapolate a list of factors present in both successful reunifications and in failed reunifications. So this is my table of factors that are present in successful and failed reunifications. Factors in successful reunifications included trial home visits, as we just discussed, increased aftercare and reunification services, which are the services we touched on earlier, and also the younger age of a child. The factors that were present in failed reunifications first included the child displaying higher rates of problem behaviors or behaviors that led to them being placed in foster care. Second, race was a factor, as several studies showed that African American and non-white children and families had lower rates of successful reunification than white children and families. Third, the child spending a longer length of time in foster care was shown as a factor present in failed reunifications, especially when the child is in foster care for longer than 6 months. Finally, a group of factors related to parents was also identified, mainly including families having multiple children living in the home, parents dealing with mental or physical health problems, parents who had criminal involvement, parents who had issues with substance abuse, and families who had been involved in the child welfare system with children entering and exiting care multiple times. When examining these factors, one major theme stuck out to me: connection. The factors of successful reunification all had the theme of connection between the child and their biological family in common, and the factors of failed reunification showed a lack of connection between the child and their family. This theme of connection formed the foundation for the rest of my capstone project. One of the most basic needs of a human being is to feel a sense of community in both larger groups and interpersonal relationships. Children who have been placed in foster care have to deal with the trauma of losing their family, not to mention the disruption of their relationships and their attachments. Children in foster care often have trouble creating and maintaining emotional and relational connections with other people, and connections with their biological family are at particular risk. Placing a child in foster care disrupts their relationship with their family, and it takes special effort to preserve the family's connections with each other so that the child's eventual transition home can be successful and the child can remain in their home environment for good. Evidence suggests that children who successfully reunify with their families have healthier connections with their families than children whose reunifications are not successful, and that contact with biological family during foster care placement can contribute to healthy child development. Likewise, many children placed in foster care report feeling abandoned by their family. So, maintaining family contact can alleviate that child's sense of abandonment, as well as other intense negative emotions that are often associated with being placed in foster care. Children who have higher connectedness with their parents tend to display lower rates of problems, both internal and external. And children with increased connections to their communities have lower rates of mental health issues and suicide and higher rates of academic achievement. As I thought through how to conceptualize this issue through a theoretical framework, I kept coming back to family systems theory. So, family systems theory is one of the most widely accepted theories that could help in understanding why reunifications from foster care fail so frequently. Several founding family therapy practitioners developed family systems theory in the 1940s and 50s, following their interpretation of general systems theory, which was developed by people in science, engineering, and technology related fields. These family therapy clinicians saw the benefit of connecting general systems theory to the way that clinicians conceptualized family interactions. By conceptualizing family interactions as cyclical instead of linear, clinicians could account for behavioral loops that could explain processes within families in better detail. By shifting thinking from linear to systems, therapists were able to understand family members' influence on each other and how family members' behaviors impacted other family members, which in turn allowed therapists to conceptualize families as units or systems with many different system parts all working together, exhibiting unique patterns of behavior, all contributing to the family's dynamics. According to family systems theory, viewing an individual outside of the context of their family system gives the clinician an incomplete picture of the person's life and causes the clinician to miss necessary information that could be beneficial in the person's treatment. Dr. Murray Bowen is considered the pioneer of family systems theory, and he developed the original theory when working with families with psychiatric diagnoses, specifically mothers and children in which the child was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He went on to work with families who did not have psychiatric diagnoses in order to apply his theory to a more broad population. Dr. Bowen's theory initially had 6 main concepts, and he later added 2 more to total 8 main concepts of family systems theory. While all 8 concepts relate to the issue of failed reunification, there's 2 concepts that relate the most: triangles and differentiation of self. So we'll talk about triangles first. One of the concepts of family systems theory that applies in child welfare is the concept of triangles, which occurs when a relationship between 2 people adds a third person with either intentionally or unintentionally with the purpose of mitigating conflict between the 2 original relationship members. Triangles happen all the time in family systems. For example, children often act as triangles between their parents to alleviate tension in their parents' relationship. But triangles have special application in child welfare. In some family systems, the child may serve as a triangle, but in families involved in the child welfare system, there are countless other people who could be involved as the third person in a family's triangle. A family's state child welfare worker, their case manager, therapist, even school personnel could become involved with a family as members of their triangle. Plus, foster parents can accidentally or intentionally become part of triangles between children and biological parents. The concept of differentiation of self, on the other hand, refers to a person's capacity to uphold their sense of identity during social interactions. And this concept can provide insight on a family's ability to maintain their child in the home environment after reunification. Dr. Bowen suggested that people who have strong differentiation can cultivate healthy, sustaining relationships that strike a balance between the demands of independence and intimacy. In contrast, people who are not differentiated well are more likely to encounter interpersonal challenges, such as disagreements with others, elevated anxiety levels, that sort of thing. In other words, families who have strong differentiation may be more likely to experience successful reunification than families who do not. Let's talk a little bit about types of family systems. So a closed system occurs when a family's interdependence is so high that the family members don't allow any outsiders in, sometimes even as strict as not even allowing grandparents in. Closed systems function as self-contained units with rigid boundaries against the external environment so they can resist outside influences. Semi-closed systems allow some outsiders, but still mostly function as a self-contained unit, with boundaries that are a little bit more flexible than closed systems. Both closed and semi-closed family systems can restrict family members' access to the outside world, which can leave children unprepared for life outside of the family system when they become adults. Open systems are what we think of when we think of the phrase, "it takes a village." Open systems welcome outsiders and maintain flexible boundaries with outside influences, allowing them in while still monitoring them for problems. Open systems are found much more often in folk-type societies, and here in the United States, most families function as closed or semi-closed systems. Despite American culture favoring closed and semi-closed systems, foster families are expected to operate as open family systems to allow outsiders from child welfare in. The transition from a closed family to an open family system can be extremely difficult, and many families struggle to make that switch, which leaves child welfare social workers with an interesting task of bridging the gap between two closed family systems so that the child can have a smooth transition between families when reunification occurs. So, how can social workers facilitate connection between children placed in foster care and their families if both the biological and foster families are closed systems? I believe the answer to that question is in adapting family systems theory to fit child welfare populations. The key finding in my conceptual paper is the discrepancies between the closed and semi-closed biological and foster families. And I am suggesting some adaptations to family systems theory for child welfare settings that could help social workers increase connections between families and ultimately improve reunification rates. So that leads us into our practice application paper, where I discussed adapting family systems theory to fit child welfare settings and suggested a six-part intervention involving social workers, foster families, and biological families that would help everyone conceptualize the family systems differently in order to improve reunification rates. So, as we just talked about, since most American families operate on a closed or semi-closed system, connections between families can be extremely difficult to create and maintain. Traditional family systems theory does not account for the need to incorporate more than one family system in a client's treatment, but that would be the most beneficial path to take for a child in foster care who's caught between their biological and foster family systems. So, how do we make family systems theory fit for child welfare involved families? Well, I'm proposing adapting family systems theory as a solution to that issue. My adapted family systems theory suggests viewing the child's biological and foster families as members of one larger family unit rather than two separate family units. This diagram represents the differences between traditional family systems theory and my adapted theory. By encouraging one family system rather than multiple separate systems, social workers can assist the children and families in maintaining strong connections during the child's placement in foster care with the eventual goal of successful reunification. Social workers are the key element in ensuring connections between families are maintained, but these connections are often viewed by social workers as an afterthought. Visitation is scheduled according to the minimum requirements. There's little emphasis placed on contact between the child and their biological family outside of minimally required visitation. And many foster families view biological families through an increasingly negative lens. Social workers have to change their own conceptualization of a family system to include both biological and foster families as one family system to make sure that successful implementation of the adapted system, family systems theory happens. The key advantage of this adapted theory is the ability to maintain connection between family systems much easier than in the traditional family systems model. But in order to implement this new theory and change the way we view family systems in child welfare practice, it is crucial to not only involve social workers, but also biological and foster families. So let's talk a little bit about what that might look like. I am proposing 6 key strategies to implement this new adapted family systems theory in child welfare practice. First, arguably the most important part of this intervention, training with social workers and inclusion in social work education curriculum. Child welfare social workers can receive this training as part of their ongoing mandated training for their employment. It could include teaching the adapted family systems theory and teaching social workers how to conceptualize families in this way. Currently, social workers learn about theory, including traditional family systems theory, in their BSW or MSW coursework. But including this adapted family systems theory in that curriculum in education will lay the foundation for future child welfare social workers to conceptualize families like this right off the bat. Second, we've got training with foster parents during initial certification and then ongoing. Once social workers are on board and are conceptualizing families through this adapted family systems theory lens, The foster families have to be taught the same things so that they can reconceptualize their own families through this lens. There's no federal mandates on foster parent training. So, similar to the rest of the child welfare system, it is left up to the state to decide what gets incorporated in foster parent training. Becoming a foster parent involves extensive training, mostly including topics like child development, behavior management, trauma, CPR and first aid, substance abuse, self care, that sort of stuff. While all of that stuff is very helpful, it doesn't really speak to the function of their family system. And foster families have to understand that connection is the most important factor for a child in foster care, and that they are conceptualizing their family systems like this to make sure that child maintains the best possible connection with their biological family. Third strategy is daily contact between the child and their biological family. Research indicates that children who have lots of contact with their bio family during placement in foster care have healthier child development than children who have infrequent or no contact with biological family. So I'm suggesting requiring foster parents to facilitate daily contact if it is safe to do so between the child and their biological family. In the same vein as daily contact, I'm also suggesting increasing minimum visitation requirements. Once again, visitation requirements vary state to state, and social workers often start families at the minimum and work their way up from there. But that creates a huge divide between the child and their family. A child goes from living with their family 24/7 to only visiting with them once a week for an hour, which is the suggested minimum in Kentucky. And that child loses a huge source of connection, which makes reunification really difficult. Number 5, we've got trial home visits. We talked a lot about that. So I am suggesting requiring trial home visits before every reunification. We talked earlier that families who participated in trial home visits have better rates of reunification than families who do not. So I am suggesting incorporating trial home visits with every family before reunification. Last, I am suggesting family therapy that involves not only the child and their biological family, which is common in child welfare right now, but also members of their foster family. Since traditional family systems theory suggests that clinicians have an incomplete picture of the client if they don't conceptualize the client within their family system, to really use the adapted family systems theory in practice, members from all the parts of the larger system have to participate. So not only can this help facilitate better connections, but also improve relationships between the biological and foster families, which can lead to an easier transition once reunification occurs. So to see this adapted theory in action, we're going to talk through a case vignette. Violet's case vignette can be used as an example for how adapted family systems theory can have an impact on the success of reunification. Just so that you all are aware, this vignette is a compilation of clinical experiences. It does not represent any specific individual or family, and any and all possible identifying information has been changed or omitted to ensure confidentiality. So Violet was 7 years old when she was removed from her biological family and placed in foster care. She had arrived at school with a large bruise on her cheek and stated in class that her mother had hit her, which triggered a mandated report from Violet's teacher to Child Protective Services. In Kentucky, it would be DCBS. The report was investigated by DCBS, which revealed environmental neglect, including a cockroach infestation and a lack of running water in the family home. And Violet's mother admitted to DCBS that she had hit her daughter in the face. Violet was removed from the family at that time and placed in foster care. At the time of her removal, Violet and her family were assigned a social worker who was employed by DCBS to assume custody of Violet while she was in foster care. Their social worker, Michelle, received her MSW and learned about this adapted family systems theory in her education curriculum. She was also extensively trained on reunification during her new hire process at the state and later in yearly refresher trainings, including training on traditional and the adapted family systems theory, and how the adapted family systems theory could improve reunification rates. Michelle thoroughly understood the importance of maintaining connections between Violet and her biological family, and Michelle was held accountable for facilitating these connections with her supervisor in biweekly staff meetings and in weekly individual supervision. Michelle fully believed in the adapted family systems theory and viewed biological and foster families as part of the child's family unit, with the goal of fostering healthy relationships for all family members. Violet was placed in foster care with the Cooper family, who were seasoned foster parents and did not have any other children in their home at the time. The Coopers received information about adapted family systems theory during their initial foster parent orientation and in yearly ongoing trainings, like Michelle's training as a social worker. The emphasis on connection between biological and foster families was especially important to the Coopers, who stated that prior to becoming foster parents, they had never thought about considering biological family members as members of their own family system. As soon as Violet was placed with the Coopers, they began daily contact with Violet's biological family with the prompting of Michelle. The Coopers reported that this daily contact became an integral part of the family's routine, with phone calls or video chats usually occurring while the Coopers drove Violet to school on the weekdays and just after breakfast on the weekends. Violet also attended frequent visitation with her biological family and never went more than a week without in person contact with them. The Coopers reported that Violet seemed to transition into their home a little bit easier because they began those phone calls with her biological family right away. Violet knew she had an opportunity every morning to talk to her biological family, and the Coopers reported that Violet seemed pretty disappointed if contact did not occur. Michelle shared that the Coopers seemed to embrace the adapted family systems theory concept so much that they worked hard to make sure that Violet had contact with her family even more than the required minimums. Michelle also referred Violet and the family members for family therapy, and so sessions included Violet, her foster mother, and her biological mother. These sessions were provided by a licensed clinical social worker who utilized the adapted family systems theory in order to bridge gaps between biological and foster families, with the ultimate goal of easing the transition between the families during Violet's visitation and during her reunification. The social worker was able to assess differences between the biological and foster families because they were viewing Violet in the context of both families. And that contributed to Violet's various challenges during her foster care experience. So the social worker was able to see those challenges and help change them because she viewed Violet's family within the context of biological and foster. The social worker reported assessing these differences and viewing Violet within her current environment in foster care and the environment with her biological family contributed heavily to the family's connections with each other and ultimately to Violet's successful reunification. As Violet continued in foster care towards reunification, Michelle worked with her biological family to clean up the environmental issues in the home and assign them parenting classes to learn effective discipline strategies and ways to manage their anger that did not result in physical violence. Violet's family reported these classes were helpful, and Michelle noted that the family was able to implement the strategies learned in the classes when she observed them in visitation. Following the biological family's completion of parenting classes, the cleanup of their home, attending family therapy, and several months of increasing the frequency and duration of visitation, Michelle placed Violet back with her biological family for a trial home visit. No issues arose during the trial home visit, and biological family regained custody of Violet following its completion. Violet remained with her biological family following reunification at the 5-year mark, and her family reported that they maintain regular contact with the Coopers and they even celebrate holidays together. So this vignette shows the importance of connection and how a social worker can facilitate successful reunification by viewing families as members of the same family system rather than separate systems. Let's talk a little bit about my key findings across the Capstone project and some implications for current and future social work practice. So the highlight of adapting family systems theory to fit child welfare is the focus on connection and the importance of maintaining connections between the child and their biological family and creating connections between biological and foster families. Children and families who maintain strong connections with each other appeared to have higher rates of successful reunification than children and families who did not. Family systems theory suggests that social workers have an incomplete picture of a client without conceptualizing them in their environment. But since children in foster care are caught between their biological home environment and their foster home environment, family systems theory does not account for a unique population like that. In foster care, the child is temporarily joining a different family system, so we have to adapt the theory to include biological and foster families in the same family system. That helps bridge that gap and promote healthy connection. By implementing an intervention focused on connection, the gap between families is addressed and reunification has a much better chance of success. Violet's case vignette does demonstrate a successful reunification between a child in foster care and their biological family, conceptualized through that adapted family systems theory framework. To implement this intervention on a larger scale, there are some considerations for social work practice to discuss. So first, many of the changes that are suggested in this intervention are big macro level changes, like increasing contact and visitation requirements. This is one of the biggest barriers to implementation. Policy changes at a federal level would need to occur in order to ensure that this intervention is implemented appropriately across the United States. There's also micro and meso level barriers, the biggest being buy-in from social workers and foster families into this new adapted theory. We've heard the colloquial phrase about not being able to teach an old dog new tricks, but that's a real barrier for implementing this new theory. Social workers and foster parents who've worked in child welfare forever may have trouble getting on board with these new ideas. And if social workers aren't on board, changes are not going to happen like they need to. Change takes time, especially when social workers are trying to make macro level changes, but the 6 elements of this intervention can be implemented without systemic change to the child welfare system. Even without increased mandates on frequency of contact and visitation, social workers work with biological and foster families on a micro level to increase connections. For instance, social workers could ask foster parents to facilitate daily contact despite their mandated minimum being less than daily. They could arrange for frequent visitation, and they could facilitate transportation if needed. They could make referrals for family therapy, and they could require a trial home visit. Agencies that train social workers and foster parents could incorporate training on the importance of connection into their current training curriculums. All of these elements really only require the work of a few motivated social workers to implement them with families and improve reunification rates. So as social workers implement this intervention, they may discover other elements that could improve connections between children and families. This is certainly not an exhaustive list of interventions. While this intervention does offer practical steps for social workers, there are a ton of other ways that a child can maintain or improve their connection with their biological family that are not specifically addressed in my suggested intervention. Adopting a mantra of encouraging connection opens possibilities for social workers to tailor the intervention in unique ways to meet the specific needs of each family. For example, in one situation where the biological and foster families live close to each other, it might be beneficial for the families to bond by attending the child's dance recital or going to a community event together. In other situations where maybe distance is a barrier, it might be beneficial for the families to connect virtually in a support group or another online event. Ongoing evaluation of the elements to ensure that they are improving connections and regular supervision of the social worker by someone who's trained in this theory, trained to conceptualize families in this way, is crucial to ensuring fidelity and making sure everything is working. So as this new intervention is implemented in child welfare settings and reunification rates hopefully are increasing, there are some new questions that arise for further study and some new implications for practice are generated. The interventions training of social workers and foster parents could potentially create a significant shift in mindset among all parties involved in the child welfare system. That could open questions about what else social workers could do to sustain the mindset shift and encourage systemic change. Further study to examine different elements that could be included in this intervention would be required. Additionally, some questions surrounding the diversity of client populations and the impact on implementation, other barriers to implementation, and the success of this intervention 3 or more years after reunification would be important to examine. Finally, studying the families who did not experience successful reunification despite implementing this intervention could lend some insight on the mechanics of the intervention and offer some ideas to improve. So, to summarize, for many children placed in foster care, successful reunification with their biological family is the ultimate goal. Removing a child from their biological family and being made to live with strangers in foster care is a really traumatic experience. Compounding the trauma by only allowing them infrequent contact with the only family they've ever known is really damaging. It has lasting influence on the child's well being. While there are many barriers that can cause reunification to fail, implementing an adapted family systems theory framework with families involved in child welfare is a promising step towards increasing rates of successful reunification. This framework starts with social workers. Changing the social work perspective on family units and child welfare could have a major impact not only on the success of reunification, but also on the child's experiences within the foster care system. I recommend incorporating this adapted family systems theory in social work education curriculum and in employment training at child welfare agencies. This ensures the importance of connection is taught both in an academic setting as part of the foundation for social work when a social worker is first becoming a social worker, and through employment-based continuing education throughout the social worker's career. Like we said, change starts with the social worker, and the social workers who learn the importance of connection and how to create and maintain connections between the child and their biological family can disseminate that education to foster parents, biological families, and other foster care stakeholders so that the goal of reunification can be reached for every child and family. At the end of the day, we want these kids at home with their families as much as possible. This adapted family systems theory framework gives everyone involved the tools that they need to make reunification a reality and keep kids with their families for good. All right, that's my presentation. I have 4 slides of references, so I will just kind of scroll through those quickly, and then I think that's all I got.
Great presentation, AmyLynne. Are there any questions out there? Let's see. In the chat, we have, let's see, from Angela Jamison. I think this could revolutionize the foster care system. However, as a 15-year-old foster parent, I can sing the importance of connection with birth families all day long, but I can't change the mind of someone who is scared, apprehensive, or anxious to do so. The biggest barriers are often the very real human emotions and judgments of the adults involved in the triangle.
Absolutely. Yes. I have worked in child welfare for 10 years, and that is also what I've seen. It is very difficult to bridge that gap and to make those connections, which is why it's so important for social workers to step up and be the facilitator there. I think there are lots of options for training on the foster parent side of things. But obviously we're not going to send a biological parent to a foster parent training, although it might be helpful at times. But the goal is to, because the social worker and the foster family are kind of on board with conceptualizing their families in that way, the hope is that the foster family can kind of guide that biological family to be a little bit more open and have a little bit more of those connections. Obviously, I'm sure all of you have worked with families that this wasn't possible with. As much as we would love for it to be possible for everybody, there's just sometimes that reunification isn't possible. There's times that an intervention like this isn't possible. But there are also times, I'm sure most of us can think of times with other families who reunification probably was possible, but the child was in care so long and they lost a lot of that connection with their biological family. And so that made that transition really difficult. And they ended up back in foster care. So that is why I'm hoping to improve that. Thank you, Jonathan. I think I feel like we may have worked together before, Jonathan. So I appreciate that. he talked about that this presentation highlighted that visits are necessary to bridge the gap, prepare for reunification. That is a super important. I've only interned when I got my MSW with the state, but I've spent my whole career working in therapeutic foster care. And so it's always exciting to hear like the DCBS side of things as well. Thank you.
AmyLynne, I think you did an excellent job, and I'm excited. I work in foster care, and I will be start working on my capstone here in the summer. And mine is going to be similar, but not exactly the same. So so this is like just a interesting concept that you have, and I agree that the foster families, really the foster agency wrapping the foster families and encouraging those connections are so important. So I've really, this is the first one I listened to. I'm so glad I was able to make it to hear it. I think you did an excellent job. I'm so excited for you. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. That is one advantage that I really like about working in like therapeutic foster care versus being a DCBS worker. DCBS caseloads are just insane. Like, I mean, that's even if you don't work in child welfare, you just know like every state worker is completely overwhelmed with the amount of kids that they have. But there's regulations in Kentucky for how many children we serve in therapeutic foster care. And so because we have smaller caseloads, we're able to give each family more attention. And especially in my work as a therapist, that allowed me to bridge those gaps that I had the freedom to reach out to a biological family when really it didn't seem like anybody else on the case was communicating with them. I've had several families reach out to me and be like, "You're the only person we've talked to this whole time," or like they outside of their DCBS worker, they have no idea what's going on with their child. And that has been 10 years ago that we started doing that. So I have seen what an issue this is, and excited to work on it for the last few years doing this research.
Great job, AmyLynne.
Thank
I've put the link in the chat for those of you that want to receive CE credit. You can go ahead and check that out. Thank you again. Thanks for your patience in the beginning.
Thank you, Dr. Grant.
Yeah. Have a good rest of your day.
All right. Thank you.